It was a quiet Friday night, and Sarah decided to unwind by watching her favorite horror movie. The night felt perfect for it. Rain tapped against the window, and the house was dark, creating the perfect eerie atmosphere. What she didn't know was that the scariest part of her evening wouldn't come from the movie, but from something much closer to home. Sarah had always enjoyed watching horror movies alone. She found comfort in the thrill of the scares, knowing it was all just fiction. She popped some popcorn, dimmed the lights, and curled up on her couch as the movie began. The movie was intense, filled with jump scares and unsettling imagery, but Sarah remained glued to the screen. Halfway through, the lights in her house flickered, but she paid no mind. Storms often caused small electrical issues, and she was too engrossed in the plot to care. As she watched, something strange happened. In one scene, the protagonist of the movie looked into a mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind them. It was the kind of scene that made Sarah's heart race, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in her own reflection on the dark TV screen. She paused the movie, glancing behind her. Nothing. Just the empty, quiet living room. Her heart raced a little faster, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination. Sarah resumed the movie, but a nagging feeling of unease crept up her spine. As the movie progressed, Sarah noticed the reflection in the TV again. This time, the shadow was more distinct, tall, dark, and standing unnervingly close to where she sat. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned to look behind her again. The room was empty. But the reflection in the TV screen told a different story. The shadow was still there, motionless. Sarah froze, fear creeping into every part of her body. The only sound was the steady tapping of the rain on the window. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just a trick of the light or a leftover image from the movie. But as she sat there, she felt a presence. Something cold, something watching. Her hands trembled as she reached for the remote to turn off the TV, but before she could press the button, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. The only light now came from the occasional flash of lightning outside. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden blackness. She fumbled for her phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. It was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was there with her. The reflection on the dark TV screen had seemed so real. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Sarah jumped, her phone nearly slipping from her grasp. She cautiously made her way to the door, her heart racing with every step. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing. No one was there. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure if she should open it. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. But when she looked again, still no one was there. Fear surged through her, and she backed away from the door, retreating to the safety of her bedroom. She locked the door behind her, her mind racing. Whatever had been in that reflection was now outside, or maybe it was still inside. Sarah spent the rest of the night in her room, wide awake, listening for any signs of movement. Morning came, and when she finally stepped out of her room, everything seemed normal again. But the memory of that shadow, and the feeling of being watched, never left her. To this day, Sarah refuses to watch horror movies alone, especially on a stormy night. Tom had always been a fan of late-night horror marathons. His friends would joke that nothing scared him. But one night, while binge-watching a series of terrifying films, he discovered that some fears can't be explained away by logic or jokes. It was 1 a.m., and Tom was deep into his third horror movie of the night. He loved the feeling of tension, the way the films played with fear and suspense. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering images on the screen. The movie he was watching involved a haunted house and a cursed family, with plenty of supernatural scares. The tension in the movie was building, but Tom remained calm, sipping his drink and enjoying the show. Then, in the middle of a particularly quiet scene, he heard a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tap, tap, tap against the window. Tom paused the movie, his eyes shifting toward the large glass window to his left. At first, he saw nothing. The darkness outside was thick, with no streetlights to illuminate the yard. He shrugged it off as the wind or maybe a stray branch hitting the glass. But then, the tapping came again, louder this time. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He set his drink down, slowly rising from the couch to get a better look. As he approached the window, his breath fogged up the glass, obscuring his view. He wiped it away, squinting into the blackness beyond. For a moment, all he saw was his own reflection staring back at him. But then, his reflection shifted, and standing just behind it, on the other side of the window, was a face. It was pale, ghostly, and staring straight at him. Tom stumbled back in shock, his heart racing in his chest. He blinked, thinking it had to be some sort of trick of the light, but when he looked again, the face was still there. It wasn't moving, just staring. Panic surged through him. He grabbed his phone, ready to call someone, but his hands were shaking too much to dial. He backed away from the window, not daring to take his eyes off the pale figure outside. Suddenly, the face moved. It pressed closer to the glass, and Tom could see the fog of its breath against the window. His heart pounded as he realized this wasn't just his imagination, someone, or something, was really out there. In a moment of sheer panic, Tom yanked the curtains closed, blocking the terrifying image from view. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more urgent, as if the figure was trying to break through the glass. Tom backed away, his mind racing. Who was out there? What did they want? He paced the room, his hands trembling, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. For a long time, Tom stood frozen in place, listening for any sign that the figure was still outside. Finally, after what felt like hours, he gathered the courage to peek through the curtains. The face was gone. There was nothing but the dark yard and the reflection of his own terrified expression staring back at him. But Tom knew what he had seen. That night, he didn't sleep. And from that point on, he never sat near that window while watching movies again. Sometimes, the scariest moments don't come from what we see, but from what we feel. For Rachel, a simple movie night at her friend's house became an experience she would never forget, an experience that left her questioning reality itself. Rachel and her friend Emily had planned a quiet night in, watching a few scary movies at Emily's house. The two of them had always loved horror films, and it was a perfect way to relax after a long week. Emily's house was cozy, and the two settled in with popcorn, ready for a night of scares. The first movie they watched was creepy, but nothing too intense. It wasn't until they started the second movie that things began to feel strange. Rachel noticed at first, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the room's atmosphere. It was as if the air had grown colder, heavier. She brushed it off, thinking it was just her imagination or maybe the effects of the movie playing tricks on her mind. But then, the feeling grew stronger. As the movie progressed, Rachel couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone in the room. She glanced over at Emily, who seemed unfazed, completely engrossed in the film. Rachel tried to focus on the movie, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Then, out of nowhere, the TV flickered. The lights in the room dimmed for a brief moment before returning to normal. Emily laughed it off, saying it was probably just a power surge. But Rachel felt her heart race. Something wasn't right. She shifted uncomfortably on the couch, feeling a cold draft brush against her skin. Suddenly, she felt it, a soft, icy touch on her shoulder. Rachel froze, her body tensing up. She slowly turned her head, expecting to see Emily playing a prank on her. But Emily was sitting across the room, far out of reach. Rachel's stomach dropped. She stared at Emily, wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Emily noticed her expression and asked if everything was okay. Rachel hesitated, unsure of whether to say anything, but the fear in her chest was overwhelming. "I think something just touched me," Rachel whispered. Emily raised an eyebrow, glancing around the room. "There's no one else here," she said with a nervous laugh. But her tone suggested that she wasn't entirely sure. The two girls sat in silence for a few moments, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Finally, Emily suggested they turn the movie off and call it a night. Rachel agreed, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. But as they stood up to leave, the lights flickered again. This time, the TV turned off completely, and the room was plunged into darkness. A sudden, sharp bang echoed through the house, coming from the kitchen. Both girls froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Rachel felt that cold presence again, like an unseen figure was standing right behind her. Emily grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight to guide them to the kitchen. The two of them crept toward the source of the noise, their breaths shallow and quick. When they reached the kitchen, they found nothing out of place. The room was silent, still. But Rachel could feel it. That presence, that coldness, it hadn't left. They didn't stay long. Both girls quickly grabbed their things and left the house, refusing to talk about what had happened. Rachel never went back to Emily's house after that night. And to this day, she still can't explain what touched her, or what made that noise in the kitchen. But she's certain of one thing, they weren't alone. Each of these stories reminds us that sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones we see, but the ones we can't explain. Always trust your instincts, and never ignore the feeling that something isn't right. Because sometimes, the fear we feel is a warning of something much more real than we want to believe.